At the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, where the land stretched out in a desolate expanse of white and silence, the temperature had plummeted to a bone-shattering 40°C. The air was so cold it seemed to crackle, the kind of cold that bit deep and unforgivingly, turning breath into plumes of ghostly mist. Snow-covered pines stood as sentinels against the biting wind, their branches heavy and frozen, locked in an eternal shrug beneath the weight of the elements. Beneath a sky painted in hues of steel gray, Ethan Walker's cabin stood, a solitary speck of humanity carved into the edge of this unforgiving expanse. The cabin itself was a modest structure, rough-hewn logs stacked with utilitarian precision, the seams sealed with old-fashioned moss and sap. Its steeply sloped roof, laden with snow, seemed almost to bow beneath the weight of isolation. Frost etched patterns across the narrow windows, and through the faint glow within, one could barely make out the flicker of a fireproof of life amidst the vast emptiness. This was no picturesque getaway. It was a fortress against nature's unrelenting wrath, the only barrier between Ethan and the brutal cold outside. To outsiders, the cabin might appear humble, even grim, but to Ethan, it was sanctuary. A choice deliberately made, not imposed. In its quiet walls, miles from the noise of the modern world, he found the kind of peace that civilization could never offer. The distance from people was not a matter of convenience, but a necessity, a calculated retreat to a place where he could wrestle with his thoughts undisturbed. But even in its seeming tranquility, the cabin carried an air of suspense, as if the wilderness beyond its walls was biding its time, waiting for the moment when it might test the will of the man inside. Outside, the wind howled, clawing at the wooden walls like a restless spirit, testing their resolve against its ferocity. Within, the sound of crackling wood in the stone fireplace was the only accompaniment to Ethan's solitude. Each flame danced like a fleeting promise of warmth, defying the dark, frigid unknown that lurked just outside the door. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It was a symbol, a defiant stand against nature's relentless power and the enduring strength of one man's will to endure it. For Ethan Walker, every day in the frozen heart of the Alaskan wilderness began with ritualistic precision, a carefully constructed dance with survival. The first light of dawn was a pale, muted glow that barely pierced the thick frost clinging to the cabin's windows, casting the interior in a soft, icy haze. Before the fire in the stone hearth dwindled to embers, he was already stirring, wrapped in layers of wool and thermal fabrics that were as much armor as clothing. Each step of his routine was deliberate, honed by necessity, and shaped by the unrelenting environment that surrounded him. The day's first task was to check the weather, a matter of life and death in a place where conditions could shift from harsh to lethal in the span of an hour. The old shortwave radio crackled with bursts of static as Ethan adjusted the knobs, his breath visible in the cold air, despite the fire's warmth. Forecasts in this part of the world weren't about rain or shine. They spoke in the grim language of wind speeds, whiteout warnings, and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. He jotted notes on a dog-eared notepad, the pencil trembling slightly in his gloved hand. Next came a meticulous inspection of his emergency equipment. The sat phone, the flare gun, the first aid kit, all laid out on the wooden table, examined with the same care a soldier might give to their weapon before battle. He unrolled coils of rope and checked his snowshoes for any signs of wear. The harsh terrain was unforgiving. A single broken strap or jammed piece of gear could mean the difference between making it home or being swallowed whole by the wilderness. Ethan worked in silence, his movements efficient, almost mechanical, as though the act of preparation itself warded off disaster. By mid-morning, He would make his rounds, checking the stores of dried meat, rice, and canned goods stacked neatly against one wall of the cabin. Weeks of isolation taught him the value of rationing, and he moved with the focus of someone who understood that every calorie consumed was a step closer to the next supply run, if the weather allowed it. Even water, plentiful in theory, required effort. Snow melted down on the wood stove, yielded only a fraction of its volume, and the process was slow, demanding constant attention. But beyond the physical tasks, it was the isolation that gnawed at him most. The silence out here was not a peaceful hush, but a deafening void, broken only by the wind's howl or the occasional groan of ice shifting in the distance. At first, it had been liberating, a way to escape the relentless hum of civilization. But as weeks turned to months, the solitude began to shape him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Thoughts that once felt distant now crept closer, louder, their voices amplified by the absence of any other sound. There were days when the cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, its walls closing in as the wilderness outside seemed to mock his fragile humanity. Ethan found himself talking aloud sometimes, small comments about the weather, muttered observations about the fire just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. He would laugh at his own jokes, a sharp, hollow sound that faded too quickly in the still air. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was something deeper, more primal, a slow unraveling that came from being alone with one's thoughts for too long. Yet, there was a part of him that thrived in this harsh, untamed world. The wilderness demanded respect and resilience, and in meeting its challenges, Ethan found a sense of purpose that had eluded him in the chaos of modern life. Each day was a test, each task a small victory against the relentless cold and the creeping shadows of his own mind. Out here, survival was both an act of defiance and a declaration of intent, a promise to himself that he would endure, no matter how deep the snow piled or how loud the wind roared. The storm came suddenly, a tempest of swirling snow and howling wind that descended upon the wilderness with a ferocity Ethan Walker hadn't seen in years. He had noticed the signs earlier that morning, the darkening of the horizon, the eerie stillness in the air that seemed to hold its breath before releasing its fury. By midday, the world outside the cabin had vanished, swallowed whole by the blizzard's relentless grip. Snow pelted the windows like shards of glass, and the wind screamed through the cracks in the logs, a ghostly wail that refused to be ignored. Inside the cabin, Ethan moved quickly, securing the shutters and double-checking the firewood stacked by the hearth. The warmth from the fire was comforting, but it wasn't enough to drive away the gnawing edge of unease that settled in his chest. This wasn't a typical storm. It was the kind that tested both the endurance of a man and the strength of the walls that sheltered him. He knew the temperature outside had plunged far below freezing, and with visibility reduced to mere feet. Venturing out was not just dangerous, but suicidal. As the storm raged on, an unexpected sound cut through the chaos. At first, Ethan thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but there it was again. A low, guttural growl, followed by a series of muffled thumps against the cabin's outer wall. Heart pounding, he grabbed the old hunting rifle that rested by the door, his mind racing through possibilities. Wolves? It wouldn't be unheard of in weather like this. But something about the sound didn't fit. He cautiously approached the frost-covered window, scraping away just enough of the ice to peer outside. What he saw made his breath hitch. Through the swirling snow, he could just make out the hulking form of a bear, a massive female, her thick fur crusted with frost, pacing back and forth near the cabin. And she wasn't alone. Two smaller figures trailed behind her, cubs that should have been sleeping safely in a den, not braving the deadly cold of a winter storm. Ethan's mind raced. Bears didn't venture out in weather like this, especially not with cubs. It went against everything he knew about their behavior. The sight was both unsettling and heartbreaking. The mother bear's movements were frantic, her head swinging from side to side, as if searching for something shelter, perhaps, or food. The cubs clung close to her, their small bodies dwarfed by the brutal landscape, their steps unsteady as they fought to keep up. The cabin, with its faint glow of firelight leaking through the cracks, had clearly caught her attention. She lumbered closer, her massive paws leaving deep prints in the snow. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, his instincts warring with his reason. He knew he couldn't afford to let the bears linger too close. One wrong move, and the mother might see him as a threat. But the thought of firing a warning shot felt cruel in a way he hadn't anticipated. The bears were desperate, driven to the edge by forces beyond their control, just as he was. The thumping against the wall grew louder as the mother bear tested the cabin's defenses, her claws scraping against the wood in a way that sent shivers down Ethan's spine. He backed away from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing, and for a moment he felt a kinship with the creatures outside. They too were trying to survive, clinging to life in a world that seemed intent on snuffing it out. But survival, he knew, was rarely kind. He moved toward the door, his breath steadying as he raised the rifle. The mother bear paused, her dark eyes locking with his through the narrow pane of glass. For a moment, the storm seemed to quiet, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Then, with a final guttural growl, she turned and led her cubs back into the white abyss, their forms swallowed by the storm as quickly as they had appeared. Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands trembling slightly as he lowered the rifle. The cabin felt emptier now, the silence more oppressive than before. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but within, Ethan was left with the uneasy realization that in this frozen wilderness, survival was a shared struggle, one that blurred the lines between man and beast. The storm continued to howl outside, its fury undiminished. But within Ethan Walker's cabin, a different kind of storm began to stir, one that twisted and writhed in his chest, gnawing at his resolve. He stood motionless, eyes fixed on the window, where the mother bear and her cubs now lingered just beyond the shelter of the cabin. The sight of them, battered by the wind and snow, was almost unbearable. The mother, her fur matted with ice and snow, was visibly exhausted. She swayed on her feet as if each step took a tremendous effort, her breath ragged and labored. Her dark eyes, wide with fear and desperation, searched the white void as if hoping for some sign of salvation, yet finding only the same cold emptiness. The cubs, too, were struggling. The younger of the two trembled uncontrollably, their small bodies dwarfed by the harsh landscape. Their fur, though thick, was no match for the biting chill that seemed to freeze even the air itself. One of the cubs huddled close to its mother, seeking warmth in her heavy frame, but even the shelter of her bulk seemed inadequate in the face of such an unforgiving storm. The other cub, separated by just a few feet, was clearly disoriented, its movements slow and uncoordinated as it staggered in the snow. Ethan's heart clenched at the sight. He had seen the wild in all its brutal beauty, the harsh laws of nature that governed the lives of its creatures. Survival was never guaranteed, and the fight for life was often a cruel and merciless one. But this felt different. The bears weren't just animals struggling to survive. They were victims of a world that had turned against them, driven from their den by the forces of nature in a way that no animal, no matter how strong, could contend with. The mother bear had no way of knowing the dangers she was exposing her cubs to by lingering so close to a human structure. She was only trying to keep them alive, as any mother would. The weight of the situation pressed down on Ethan like the weight of the snow piled up outside. He could see the exhaustion in the mother's movements, the hopelessness in the way she scanned the horizon, as if waiting for something, anything, that could offer a chance for survival. His fingers tightened around the rifle, the cold metal a reminder of the rules he had sworn to follow. There were protocols for this. The wilderness was unpredictable, and humans had no business interfering with the natural order of things. But there was something inside him, a quiet voice that refused to be silenced. It was the same voice that urged him to leave the cabin when the wind was too strong and the snow too thick. The same voice that had once pushed him to take risks he hadn't fully understood. This was no longer about rules. This was about compassion, about the raw, unspoken bond between creatures who shared the same struggle to endure. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. If he went out there, if he intervened, he would be breaking every rule he had ever made. Bears were dangerous, especially mothers with cubs. One wrong move could send the mother into a rage, and he would have to defend himself. But if he didn't act, if he simply watched as they succumbed to the storm, then he would be complicit in their suffering, a silent witness to their demise. The thought of leaving them to perish in the snow gnawed at him, the idea of his inaction turning their suffering into something irreversible. Ethan's breath fogged the window as he leaned closer, his eyes never leaving the trio outside. The cubs were shivering now, their small bodies visibly trembling in the icy wind, their breaths shallow as they huddled close to their mother, the mother bear. Sensing the vulnerability of her young, crouched protectively over them, her own body trembling from exhaustion. The scene before him was one of stark contrast, the unyielding, cold wilderness on one side and the fragile, desperate lives of these creatures on the other. He moved away from the window, pacing the small confines of the cabin as his mind spun with possibilities. The rules told him to stay inside, to wait for the storm to pass, to not interfere with the natural course of things. But his gut told him that these bears, these creatures of the wild, needed something more than the cold indifference of nature. They needed warmth. They needed help. As the wind battered the walls of the cabin and the storm howled louder than ever, Ethan felt the pull of an ancient, primal urge to help, to act, to break the rules in the name of survival, in the name of compassion. But each step toward the door was met with hesitation. Could he truly risk everything for the lives of these bears? Was it worth it? The storm raged on, the world outside an impenetrable blur of white, and inside, Ethan was left to face a decision that would change everything. Would he break the silence of the wilderness and step into the unknown? Or would he remain a passive observer, forever haunted by the faces of the mother bear and her trembling cubs? The moment stretched out, the tension thick in the air, as Ethan stood frozen by the door, his hand hovering over the latch. His mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts, each one pulling him in a different direction, each one challenging the very core of what he had come to believe about life, death, and survival. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling like a living thing. But in the cabin, it was as though time had slowed, the world narrowing down to the raw, jagged truth of the decision before him. For the longest time, he had lived by one simple rule: survival above all else. The wilderness was a place of harsh realities, and the laws of nature were unyielding. It wasn't just about enduring the elements. It was about respecting the balance of life and death, knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. He had always respected that balance. He had watched animals in the wild, knowing when they had to fight for survival, and when they simply had to let go. It was the way of the world. Those who could adapt, survive. Those who couldn't, perished. But standing there, his gaze fixed on the tremors running through the cubs, their fragile bodies quaking in the face of a merciless storm, something inside him shifted. The image of the mother bear, her every movement steeped in weariness, clinging desperately to her cubs in the face of a fate she couldn't escape, tore at his resolve. This wasn't a battle for territory or food. This wasn't about nature's cold calculus of survival. This was a mother trying to protect her children, and he, standing there in his warm cabin, had the power to help. His breath caught in his chest as a wave of guilt washed over him. How many times had he turned away from the suffering of others, whether human or animal, believing that intervention was futile or even dangerous? How many moments had he let pass by, thinking that the wilderness was simply too unforgiving to allow for mercy? He had come to rely on the boundaries of survival, the rules that governed this place of untamed wilderness. But those rules now seemed hollow in the face of what he was witnessing. The value of life, he realized, wasn't something to be calculated. It wasn't about some grand, detached logic of survival. It was about the act of living itself, the fragile, fleeting nature of existence. The thought of letting these creatures perish out there, alone in the cold, when he had the ability to help, felt like a betrayal of everything that made life worth living. What kind of man, what kind of person could live with the knowledge that they had watched something suffer when they had the power to end that suffering? Ethan's eyes darted to the rifle still resting against the wall, the cold metal a silent reminder of the threat the bears posed. The rules of engagement with wildlife, especially with a mother bear and her cubs, were clear. You didn't interfere. You didn't risk it. Yet, here, in this moment, those rules seemed impossibly small. He wasn't looking at a predator, a threat to his existence. He was looking at a family on the brink of death, an innocent one simply trying to survive. Could he live with himself if he turned his back now? The storm outside roared louder, the wind a shrill scream at the walls. But Ethan barely noticed. The world around him seemed to fall away as a quiet, steady resolve began to take root. This was no longer about following rules. It was about making a choice, about defying the very nature of the wilderness to protect the lives within it. The courage didn't come from the rifle or the security of his cabin. It came from the recognition that life, in all its forms, was sacred. And sometimes the only way to survive was by showing mercy, even when it felt like the world was telling you to do otherwise. With a deep breath, Ethan moved toward the door. He had never been one for heroics. He wasn't a man who sought danger, nor did he enjoy confrontation. But this was different. As he turned the latch and the door creaked open, a rush of icy wind and snow poured into the cabin, the storm now at his doorstep. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the gravity of his decision. Outside, the bears were still there, vulnerable, desperate, but for the first time, they weren't alone. Ethan stepped out into the storm, the cold biting at his face, and the door swung shut behind him with a resounding thud. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to stay within the safety of the cabin, but he ignored them. The mother bear looked up, her eyes locking with his, a mixture of suspicion and something deeper, perhaps even a flicker of hope. The cubs huddled closer to their mother, their shivering bodies still too weak to fully understand the danger they were in. Ethan made his way toward them slowly, cautiously, each step weighed with the knowledge that one wrong move could escalate this into something far more dangerous. But as he neared them, he stopped just a few feet away, his eyes never leaving the mother bears. He held his breath, waiting for her response, for her decision. In this moment, he was not a man with a weapon. He was a lifeline, a brief chance for survival in a world that had shown them no mercy. And then, after what felt like an eternity, The mother bear let out a low, wary growl, but her stance softened. Slowly, cautiously, she and her cubs retreated toward the cabin, seeking refuge from the storm. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't move. He simply stood there, his presence a silent promise. He had made his decision, and for better or worse, there was no going back. Ethan's breath came in sharp, visible bursts as he moved toward the bears, his every instinct alert to the fragile tension that hung between them. The storm raged on, its fury unabated, but the immediate danger had shifted. Now, it was about survival, not just for himself, but for the helpless creatures huddled near the cabin. The mother bear, despite her weariness, had made the choice to trust him, and with that trust, a new responsibility settled over Ethan like the weight of the snow itself. He knelt slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves that might alarm the cubs. The smallest one, still shaking from the cold, looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Its fur stiff with frost, its small form nearly lost against the white expanse of the world around them. With a gentle motion, Ethan unwrapped a heavy woolen blanket from his pack, the warmth from the cabin still embedded in its fibers. He reached toward the cub, speaking softly, though he knew the words meant little. It was the tone, the calmness that might soothe them. "It's okay," he murmured, wrapping the blanket around the cub with practiced care, his hands steady despite the adrenaline pulsing in his veins. The cub barely flinched as the blanket was draped over its shivering body, its tiny form sinking into the warmth. Ethan turned to the second cub, who was clinging closely to its mother. It too needed warmth, though it seemed more cautious, its eyes never fully leaving him. Ethan gave it space, waiting for the cub to make the first move. Slowly, the cub moved forward, its stiff limbs betraying its exhaustion. Ethan moved to cover it with another blanket, but before he could, the mother bear growled low in her throat, a sound that could have been a warning, but there was something in it that spoke of vigilance, not aggression. She had positioned herself between him and the cubs, her massive form acting as a silent shield, her eyes scanning him intently, as though weighing his every move. For a long moment, she did not approach, only watched, her body taut with a quiet energy, ready to act at the slightest threat. Ethan held her gaze, never forcing the cubs forward, but instead giving them time to adjust to the situation. He had no illusions about the danger. The mother bear could turn in an instant if she felt her young were at risk. But there was something in the way she moved, the way she observed him with a strange patience, that spoke of her recognition that he was not an enemy. With delicate care, Ethan guided the cubs inside, one by one, making sure they were safe in the storage room, a small, unheated part of the cabin where they could find respite from the storm. The room was packed with provisions, jars of preserves, sacks of grain, and dried meat. It wasn't ideal, but it was shelter, and it was warm. He left the door open just enough for the mother bear to follow if she chose. He didn't dare shut her out, but he also knew that she was unlikely to leave her cubs for long. The mother bear's patience was extraordinary, though her eyes flickered occasionally to Ethan. There was no rush. She lingered just outside the threshold, watching over her young as they settled onto the blanket-laden floor, her posture alert but not defensive. Her gaze never wavered from them, ensuring their safety as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only her family and the instinct to protect. Ethan saw the weariness in her movements, but it was tempered with an unyielding devotion that reminded him of his own struggles. She was as much a victim of this unforgiving storm as he was, yet she refused to show weakness. Ethan, standing in the doorway, realized he was holding his breath. Slowly, he took a step back, giving the mother bear room. He didn't want to crowd her, didn't want to provoke her into thinking he might try to harm the cubs. She stayed there for a long moment, her large, dark eyes scanning him, as if assessing the sincerity of his actions. Then, at last, with a soft grunt, she slowly followed the cubs into the small room, her movements deliberate and measured. Inside, the bears settled onto the blankets, curling into one another for warmth, their bodies still trembling, but no longer exposed to the full brunt of the storm. The mother bear lay down beside them, keeping close watch, her head low, her large form a steady presence in the small, dimly lit room. For a moment, everything was still. The storm outside seemed to retreat, muted by the thick walls of the cabin, and the world shrank down to the tiny family huddled together in a fragile, shared sanctuary. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but inside the cabin, a quiet miracle was unfolding in the dim light of the storage room. The mother bear and her cubs had settled, exhausted and shivering, onto the blankets that Ethan had carefully laid out for them. Time seemed to stretch, each passing minute a delicate thread in the fragile fabric of their survival. The storm, though still ferocious, was no longer the only force in the room. There was the slow, almost imperceptible shift of life, returning to the family of bears' life that Ethan had fought to preserve. It was subtle at first, the change. The cubs, once trembling uncontrollably, had begun to settle, their breathing deepening, their tiny bodies curling closer to their mother in a protective cocoon. The warmth of the blankets, coupled with the small fire that flickered in the hearth just outside the door, had begun to do its work. Slowly, the shaking that had racked the cubs' fragile forms began to ebb away. Ethan watched from the doorway, careful not to intrude too much, his gaze locked on the scene before him. The mother bear, who had been as still as stone, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, now lifted her head slightly. Her eyes, once clouded with weariness, were beginning to clear, the hard edges of alertness returning, though still tempered by the lingering effects of the storm. Each breath she took seemed less labored, less strained, as though the warmth in the small room was beginning to seep into her bones, reviving her strength. Ethan could see the faintest glint of something in her eyes, something akin to gratitude, or perhaps recognition. She shifted her massive frame carefully, settling closer to her cubs, her large body acting as a protective shield. Her movements were slower now, deliberate, but there was a grace to them, a maternal care that spoke volumes of her dedication to keeping her young safe. As the hours passed, the storm outside began to lose its ferocity, but it was the quiet moments inside the cabin that carried the weight of change. The bond between the mother and her cubs was as unbreakable as ever, but there was something else now, something Ethan couldn't quite name. The space between him and the bears had shrunk, not in physical distance, but in the unspoken understanding that had begun to form between them. The first sign came when the mother bear, after watching him carefully for what seemed like an eternity, relaxed. Her massive head, once held low in vigilance, lifted slightly as she turned her gaze toward Ethan, no longer with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity. Her body was still positioned between her cubs and the outside world, but the sharp wariness that had marked her every move since he had opened the door began to fade. Ethan, in turn, held her gaze, his eyes steady, his movements slow and deliberate. He understood that she wasn't some wild beast to be feared or avoided. She was a mother, desperate to keep her young alive, and he too had been desperate to protect them. In that shared desperation, something had shifted. A quiet bond had formed, fragile but real. Ethan's chest tightened with an unfamiliar feeling as he watched the mother bear begin to groom one of the cubs with slow, steady strokes of her tongue. The sight was humbling. There was a tenderness to the act that Ethan had never imagined in such a creature. The cub, still shivering but no longer in immediate danger, nuzzled against its mother's fur, its small form instinctively seeking comfort. Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep, visceral connection to the scene. These bears, who had been so close to death just hours ago, were now showing signs of recovery. It was as though life, despite the brutality of the storm, had found a way to return. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the storage room shifted. The once tense air, thick with the fear of the unknown, had softened. There was an unspoken understanding now, a quiet recognition of shared survival. The mother bear had stopped watching him as though he were a potential threat. Instead, her eyes followed his movements with a quiet, patient observation. She had learned that Ethan wasn't a predator, but a fleeting source of safety, a temporary refuge from the world outside. And Ethan, for his part, had learned that the wilderness was not simply a place of danger and cold isolation. It was a place where the fragility of life, human and animal alike, could coexist, if only for a brief moment. In the stillness of the room, Ethan could feel the weight of the storm outside, but also something else. The sense that life had a way of pushing back, even in the harshest of conditions. The bears, once vulnerable and at the mercy of the wild, had found their strength again. And so too had Ethan. The simple act of offering warmth, of crossing the boundary between man and beast, had changed everything. As the first light of morning began to filter through the small window, the mother bear raised her head one last time, her gaze lingering on Ethan. For a brief, fleeting moment, their eyes met again, no longer with fear, but with a shared understanding. The relationship between them, once defined by caution and distance, had transformed. It was not yet a friendship, nor could it ever be, but it was a bond forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, a bond built on trust, however tenuous. In that quiet moment, with the storm finally waning outside and the bear family now resting in safety, Ethan realized that perhaps this was the true miracle. Not that the bears had survived the night, but that, against all odds, they had learned to trust him. And he, too, had learned something about the wilderness, about compassion, and about the power of a shared struggle to survive. As the days passed and the storm eventually subsided, the family of bears began to stir, their movements now more deliberate, their strength returning in measured increments. Ethan watched from the doorway, a quiet observer of the recovery that had unfolded in the safety of his cabin. The cubs, once frail and trembling, now padded around the room with more energy, their movements lively but cautious, still mindful of the world beyond the shelter. The mother bear, her posture no longer burdened by exhaustion, stood tall, her gaze once again sharp and calculating. It was time for them to leave. Ethan, knowing the moment had arrived, felt a pang of something unexpected sorrow, perhaps, or simply the weight of the bond that had formed between them, however transient it had been. With a soft exhale, he opened the door. The cold air rushed in, filling the cabin with a chill that momentarily cut through the warmth of the fire. The mother bear looked up at him, her eyes steady, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She nudged her cubs gently, guiding them toward the open door. The trio moved cautiously out into the world, the mother bear pausing briefly on the threshold, as if taking one last look at the cabin that had sheltered them from the storm. Then, with a final glance toward Ethan, she turned, her heavy paws sinking into the snow as she led her cubs back into the wild. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, and the cabin, once filled with the heavy tension of the storm and the bear's presence, returned to its solitary stillness. Ethan stood there for a long while, staring at the door as though expecting them to return. But the wilderness had reclaimed them, as it always did. It was a stark reminder that, in the end, even the fiercest of creatures were subject to the immutable forces of nature. And yet, the memory of their time together lingered in his thoughts, a poignant reflection on the fragility of life and the unpredictable ways in which humans and animals could cross paths. In the stillness that followed, Ethan pondered what the experience had taught him. His life, once defined by solitude, had been irrevocably altered by his brief interaction with the bear family. He had entered the wilderness thinking that his role was to survive, to protect himself from the harsh environment, and to preserve the careful boundaries between human and animal. But the bears had taught him something far more profound, that survival was not just about isolation or self-preservation. It was about compassion, responsibility, and understanding. They had come to him in their time of need, and for a brief moment they had shown him that the divide between man and nature was not as wide as he had once believed. The storm had passed, but the lesson it left behind was indelible. It was a lesson not just in survival, but in the quiet power of compassion. In the wilderness, where life and death are often decided by the most elemental forces, there was also room for mercy. In the heart of the coldest storm, Ethan had found something that went beyond survival. The recognition that, as humans, our responsibility extends beyond ourselves, that we are not isolated from the world around us, but intricately linked to the creatures we share it with. And so, as the days grew brighter and the snow began to melt, Ethan understood that the true measure of survival was not in how well one could endure the harshness of the wilderness, but in how one responded to its creatures, how one could offer a hand, a gesture of kindness in the face of nature's unforgiving trials. Compassion, he realized, was not a weakness, but a strength, a quiet, steadfast power that connected him not only to the world around him, but to the very heart of the wilderness itself.